Here I've got a Retina Tele-Arton lens from Schneider, 85mm f4. This lens is for a Kodak Retina Reflex S, Retina Reflex 3, Retina Reflex 4, or the Retina 3S rangefinder camera. Would also fit a Kodak Instamatic Reflex. So I've been asked the question, how do you get into the lens to service it? Because it's different from the 50mm lenses, the 50mm Xenar lenses, different construction, and there's enough here to stop you from being able to get in. So this one I've been in before and I know how to get into it. So I'll show you this, and this will give you a good idea as to how you go about getting into this lens. Then I'll tell you what you can use if you can't use a friction tool. But we have a friction tool, and I've done this lens before. So let's try this. What we're wanting to do is unscrew this name ring that we see here. Now this is almost certainly quite tight, hard to get out. My friction tool unfortunately is a bit old and it's not as sticky as it once was. See if I can get that the rest of the way. Now I can see on this lens I've probably fought with this lens on a previous occasion, and I've drilled 2 holes to enable me to use a tool to engage in those holes and spin that ring off. You can probably see that this is slightly distorted round here. It means the lens has been dropped. It's certainly got notches and thumps and bumps in it here. Because I've got these 2 little holes in here, I can spin this thing off with a toothpick. If I had a decent friction tool I wouldn't need to play that game. So this name ring will now lift out. Let's have a look at this name ring, because this is the piece that's going to give you trouble getting into this lens. You can see that it's fairly solid construction, aluminium, it's black anodised. It's got quite a fine thread here where it screws in to the front ring at this piece here, this right piece, it screws into there. Now, in an ideal world you'd use a friction tool. You would get enough bite on that you'd be able to spin it out. As you could see, my friction tool's not really up to it. And on a previous occasion, obviously, it hasn't worked for me. Now, I'm probably not the only person that's had a go at getting into this lens, of course. What I've done here is I've drilled a hole in the aluminium at that point and directly opposite at that point to enable me to use another tool to get that off. And in fact, I think what I did use was your typical retaining ring tool with 2 points. As you can see, I've just popped that ring back on the front there. So, tools for removing that. Well, here is your traditional commercially available lens ring tool. 2 points, and this should make short work of something like this. Always assuming that you have 2 holes drilled in it to engage the tool. You must always be careful not to slip with one of these things, otherwise you will scar that name ring and it'll never look quite right again. So that sort of tool will do the job nicely. If you're enthusiastic in the workshop, you can make something like this. This is something I made many years ago to deal with one particular terrible problem, and as you can see, it's exceedingly robust, and that'll do a nice job too. There's enough depth here on my pins to get down into those holes over the front edge here. If you want to try something a bit dodgier, you can make something like this. This was a pair of circlip pliers. You can see the tips have been ground down fine. It won't span that distance on this lens, but it would do a smaller one. But you could make something like that to do the job. However, we're in, so let's have a look at this again. Here you see I'm using a wooden toothpick to spin that off. That's so that if I slip, I'm not going to gouge either a big chip out of the lens or damage the name ring. Let's take our name ring off. And you'll notice that unlike you may have expected, this does not come off. That's trapped in there. It's floating really. The front lens group here holds this piece in place, and it pretty much covers the screws that you need to take the front of the lens out of here. So you need a friction tool to remove this front lens. Let's see if that'll work for me this time. That's spun loose. Again, you see I'm using a wooden toothpick, not something metal, because if I slip, I don't want to make a mess of my lens. Now the front group should fall out. It does. There's our front group, and here is the front of that hood section. And you can see by the gouge marks there that something has scratched deep into that. I would say it's when someone has used a tool on here to try and get that glass lens free. Anyway, there's our lens. And put it down on the front surface because that's bare glass. And if you want into the rest of the mechanism, and from here on in, it's pretty much the same as the 50mm Xenar lens. Here are our 3 screws, which would allow you to lift the lens capsule out of the lens. And this is of course here is where you would make any focus adjustments that you needed to on the lens. But otherwise it's much like a 50mm Xenar. But there is the thing that we need to get out. This is the piece that floats. This is only located in the lens body by that tab there. Now that's never particularly tight. It sits in a little notch in the front of the group there, and this tends to rattle. It tends to rattle all the time. Don't be alarmed by that rattle. It means nothing really. But here's our lens group, front lens group. That would simply pop back in there, and I just want to get that lens started in its thread and run it down. This piece, this aluminium piece, is floating. The name ring pulls it up tight behind the lens. It's not crushing it back down into the lens. Now I'm using a friction tool here, so I'm not in contact with the glass, and I'll just tighten that lens up. My lens is now tight, and if I was putting it back together, it's time for the name ring. Now, if you've got a good friction tool, you'll just be using that to drive that thing back home. This one, unfortunately, it's a bit old and the rubber has lost its tackiness. It's not as good as it once was. You could say that about a lot of things. It's run back down. Now I would either tighten that with a friction tool. That's more than adequate. That's perfect. And that's the lens back together again. And that's how you get into a 85mm f4 Tele-Arton lens. One of these ones. made for the Kodak Retina Reflex. I'm not guaranteeing it's going to get you into other versions of the Tele-Arton, because Schneider probably put them into all sorts of housings for all sorts of cameras. So we have our lens. We're going to use a friction tool to get it loose. At least that's the idea. And it won't come loose. So what's the next step? Well, just past where you see the numbers there, you'll see that there's the edge of this black ring. That's where it's threaded in. And what we'd do is we'd put something there in case that's locked in there with a bit of solvent. I don't believe they are. I think it's just done up tight, and you have two anodised aluminium surfaces there. Well, anodised aluminium is very, very hard. It's like a crystalline form. I think that the threads are just bound together. But what I would normally do is just put perhaps a little drop of naphtha, cigarette lighter fluid, in there. Just a drop. You don't want to flood the lens with it. And that might lubricate that thread if the thread is just bound up. And then you try your friction tool again, and it may or may not work. This one's doing nothing for me, mostly because it's old and the rubber has lost its stickiness. But assuming that didn't work, you could try something else. You could try isopropyl alcohol, and again you'd do the same thing, just a little drop on that thread, just let it seep in. It's not a multi-start thread, it's just a conventional thread. It'll seep all the way down, and try again. And if that doesn't work, well, you might take some acetone. By this stage you're starting to think that perhaps there's some lacquer or something holding that in place, and you'd put a drop of acetone down there. And normally I would just pick up the acetone, a drop in my tweezers like this, and then apply it into that thread. Let it sit for a few seconds, never very long because I'm impatient. Then you try your friction tool again, and it might move it. Very likely it will. If it doesn't, then you are really stuck and you're going back to what I've used in the past in this particular lens, drilling a little hole directly across from each other or close to it. Because it's a name ring, it's useful not to drill through any of the lettering, because you'll never disguise the fact if you do that. So here you can see I've drilled one hole just beyond the serial number, and there's one in the middle of this space here to enable me to use the tool to engage with it. But with luck, it won't come to that. If you've got a decent friction tool, a nice new one, fresh from Mr. eBay or somewhere, or AliExpress, whoever's selling them, nice soft rubber, plenty of friction on that name ring there, and it'll come loose for you.